You may be a college student who's been assigned the essay, A Defense of Abortion by JJ Thompson. It was an essay written in 1971 and it's been immensely influential ever since. However, you know that when you're a sophomore in college, there's a lot of things you need to be doing. Those sacks aren't going to hack you themselves. And you can't be busy sitting around reading philosophy essays that are decades out of date. And that's where Dr. Miller is going to help you out and explain the whole essay in just a few minutes. No charge, just like and subscribe. I'm going to summarize the entire essay. It's got an introduction and then 8 small subsections, and then I'm going to give you 3 major challenges that could be leveled against JJ Thompson. Who was JJ Thomson? She was a professor who worked most of her career at MIT. She had an illustrious education and teaching profession and taught alongside her husband at MIT for many years. She actually just passed away in 2020. She's known primarily for 2 emphases in her writings. One is the trolley car dilemma, which I've dealt with in other videos, and the other one is abortion, and specifically this essay. This essay is still being widely read today. It's being assigned in philosophy classes, ethics classes, public policy classes, and health classes, anywhere the subject of abortion might come up. It was written in 1971, just 2 years before Roe versus Wade came out. And it actually takes some controversial and polarizing positions towards both extremes. She's going to present an argument in favor of defending abortion, but she's going to concede certain things to the pro-life camp that a lot of pro-choice folks would not want to concede. What she does is, instead of arguing that a fetus is not a life, she begins by saying, let's just grant that it is. Let's not get into a scientific debate about where life begins. Let's give the pro-life camp that concession and say that a fetus is actually a living being. She's then going to argue that you're not unilaterally, morally obligated to defend the life of a living being, or preserve the life of a living being, or spare the life of a living being. In fact, she's going to argue that in certain circumstances, you can be allowed to let someone else die. So you understand why it's a provocative essay. Let's summarize it, and then we'll get into the criticisms of the essay. She starts off in a way that she should not, by saying that she might present an argument against the claims that a fetus is a life, but then quickly says, I'm not going to defend that. But she sneaks in a bad argument about why she thinks a fetus might not be a life. Again, she's going to say, you can have this argument. Let's just begin with the assumption that a fetus is a life. But she sneaks in the introduction a suggestion that she doesn't actually think it is. And this is a mistake in a couple of different ways. One, she uses an analogy, and her essay is filled with analogies. Almost all of her arguments depend on analogies. And analogies are remarkably slippery for a number of different reasons I'm going to name at the end of the video. She says, I don't believe that a fetus is necessarily a person the way an adult is, just like I don't think an acorn is an oak tree. And that is a terrible analogy. It doesn't work in a couple of different ways. Number one, she's either arguing that the structure of an acorn is not like the structure of a mature adult, but that's a nonsensical point to make because the structure of a baby is not the structure of an adult either, and yet we grant rights to babies that we would grant to adults. So she can't be talking about the physical composition of a fetus alone. Alternatively, she might mean that an acorn is in a different category than an oak tree. But that's just question begging. The reason people have started calling an unborn child a fetus, the reason there's a debate between what to call it, is to try to distinguish whether or not it belongs in the category of adult. But that's what the argument is about. And to begin with the assertion that because we've created different categories for a fetus and adult, therefore they don't have the same moral worth, that's just question begging language. So in the end, she doesn't clarify why an acorn and an oak tree don't fit in the same category. Essentially, an acorn and an oak tree are both living things, so they do exist in the same category. And in the same way, an unborn child and an adult person both fit in the category of living human beings, and thus might be entitled to the same moral rights. So this little aside that she has in the introduction is a distraction that's poorly worded, and then she doesn't defend it. And the only reason I dwell on this is because beginning your philosophical essay with a bad argument that you don't intend to defend is like saying, I'm not a very good philosopher. I don't really know how to write things. Given that she was born in New York and lived her whole life in New England, I doubt very much that she sounded like that. But I just can't stop hearing her writing in that voice. My name is Judith Thompson, and I'm not a good philosopher, and also I like to eat babies. Nom 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 nom. So then she grants that a fetus is a person, and then she sets out to defend abortion anyway. And here's what the substance of the essay is. It's all in the introduction, and if you read nothing but the introduction, you'll get the main content of what she's after, the provocative philosophical thought experiment that she creates. She says, imagine that you awaken in a hospital and you have been connected intravenously to a famous violinist. And a doctor says, I'm very sorry, you've been kidnapped by a secret society that saves the lives of musicians, and they've done a study and found that your body alone is qualified to sustain this musician who suffers from some illness. And if you'll simply remain connected to this violinist that we've surgically connected you to for 9 months, then the violinist gets to live and you can go on your way. If you choose to disconnect yourself from this violinist, the violinist dies. Doesn't it seem like you should stay connected to this poor violinist for 9 months in order that another person should have life? And what Judith Thompson means for us to say is, no, you shouldn't have to stay connected to somebody that you've been kidnapped and forcibly attached to. You should absolutely be able to disconnect yourself, and that might be too bad for the violinist, but what business is that of yours? Well, note from the beginning, her analogy does not apply to all cases of abortion. In fact, because the person attached to the violinist has been kidnapped, this really only analogizes to the case of rape, to a woman who is forced into pregnancy. Should a woman who is forced into pregnancy be obligated to sustain the life of a child for 9 months, even if adoption is an issue thereafter, and sustain all the pain and the trauma and the physical challenges and the mental challenges that go along with that? Or is she, by virtue of the fact she did not choose this situation in any way, is she allowed to terminate the life of the unborn child because she did not will herself into this situation? Now, Thompson has a little aside in here and says, we don't really want to say that a person whose life comes about as a product of rape is therefore a less valuable person, or that they should be entitled to less rights because they were a product of rape. That doesn't seem fair. So she kind of wants the analogy to apply more widely for that reason. But again, the analogy itself is flawed from the beginning because it does not apply across the board to different instances of abortion. It applies specifically to a case of rape. She also points out, again as kind of a side note, she says that if you want to make the argument that the person is obligated to stay connected to the violinist for 9 months or a mother to a child for 9 months, there's no reason why it shouldn't be 9 years. That if you think the life is that valuable, the limited amount of time should be irrelevant to whether or not the life is valuable. She doesn't make much of that point, it's just a point she makes as she goes, and some of the essay is a little bit scattered that way. So here are the 8 sections of her essay. In section 1, she argues that in the case of the risk of the mother's health, it seems the pro-lifer has to argue that allowing someone to die, the mom, is not as bad as intentionally killing a life, particularly an innocent life. So in the case of an abortion where the mom's life is threatened, the pro-lifer is not allowed to say, well, the mom can be spared and the child can be killed. It seems like the pro-lifer is still obligated to defend the unborn child. However, she says, in a situation where either you or the violinist was going to die, quote, if anything in the world is true, it is permissible to kill the violinist. So therefore, it is permissible in some cases to kill or terminate an innocent life. She wants to establish that as the foundational work for all the rest of what she's going to write. If abortion is ever going to be permissible in any circumstance, we have to get past the hurdle of saying it's never okay to terminate someone else's life. She needs some groundwork to say there is. And in the case where a mother's life is in jeopardy, certainly, she insists, it's okay to terminate the life of the child. Notice this is another part of the weakness of her essay. She asserts things with some rhetorical force, but without necessary justification. If anything in the world is true, well, that's question begging. You have to establish that this is true. You can't just say it is. Now, all philosophers begin with presuppositions somewhere, and that's what she's doing. And maybe in many cases we have to grant presuppositions to get into the argument, but this one seems awfully close to insisting as a presupposition the thing that she's supposed to be defending. And that's what a question-begging argument is. In the second section, she addresses the argument that a woman might have a right to abortion, but a doctor who is a third party does not have the right to perform it. Now, I think that's a strange place to go because I don't hear a lot of people making that argument that women should be allowed to have an abortion if they could do it themselves, but a doctor doesn't have the right to do it for them. It's a strange second step, but that's where she goes next. Again, her writing style is a little disorganized. And now she creates another analogy to defend the fact that sometimes third parties should be involved in ethical issues. For instance, she says, if Smith owns a coat and Jones finds the coat and puts it on, and Smith is going to freeze to death without his coat, we can't very well say that of course Smith owns the coat and that's unfortunate, but we can't do anything because Jones has it on and we're a third party that can't get involved. In the same way, the mother owns her body. We can't say, well, that's just unfortunate and we can't get involved, but she certainly does own her body. So therefore, a doctor should be allowed to get involved in an ethical issue, even though it's someone else's body in question. Now, this argument's going to backfire pretty solidly the minute somebody asks, to whom does the body of the unborn child belong? Because if the mother's body belongs to her, the body of the unborn child belongs to the unborn child. And to somehow create a divorce where she gets rights that the child doesn't is going to strain again at the question that is being asked. In section 3, she says, okay, well, now we have to deal with the question of what a right to life really is. And she says a right to life does not mean that I have the right to impose on the use of someone else's body, even in little things. My right to life might be that I'm allowed not to be imposed upon by other people, but it doesn't mean that I'm allowed to impose upon others for my survival, even if it's only a small imposition on them. Now she creates another analogy. If she wants, for instance, Henry Fonda to come and lay a cool hand on her sweaty forehead so as to soothe her and allow her to continue to live, she has no right to ask it, even if it's no imposition to him, even if he's just walking across the room to do it. The fact that she needs it does not mean she gets to impose it upon him. Likewise, the violinist does not have a right to your body. The violinist's right to life does not mean the violinist gets to take control over your body. So you may have a right to life without the right to use someone else's body. Now this promises to be a slightly stronger argument. We can't say that my right to life means I get to demand anything I want of anyone I want. But we could argue the case of an unborn child is particular and distinct from Henry Fonda walking across the room to put his cool hand on Judith's forehead. In section 4, she asserts that you treat someone unjustly when you take away something that they have a right to. For instance, if two boys receive a box of chocolate for Christmas and the older one takes it away from the younger one and doesn't share it, though it was given to both of them, that is unjust. The younger one had a right to part of that box of chocolates. A woman who risks sexual behavior and then brings a life into existence has given it the right to exist. Thus, it is unjust to take the life away. Now, that's a very significant concession on the part of Judith Thomson. And this section is one in which a lot of the people who might otherwise use this essay are in a bind because they don't like what she will say here. It might likewise be argued that a woman who opens herself up to sexual behavior and the risk of bringing a life into existence thereby has an obligation to preserve that life. But, and here she creates another analogy, which again is not a good one, that's like saying a woman who leaves the window open and is then burgled has an obligation not to punish the burglar because it's her fault for leaving the window open. This is a terrible analogy. There are laws specifically prohibiting burgling. If someone does it, they are breaking through a barrier that has been created. Whereas a couple involved in sexual intercourse that get pregnant can in no way be analogized to a malicious, illegal activity. The connection between the two analogs isn't strong enough to hold. Then she creates an even worse analogy in which she says, imagine there are life seeds floating around in the wind and somebody has a screen on their window to prevent them from coming in, but one gets through the screen anyway and a life begins to grow out of the carpet. At that point, is the person responsible for raising the baby that blew in and grew in the carpet? If you can get past the weird science fiction illustration, it's still a bad analogy because there's a indirect causation in that situation, whereas a woman who willfully engages in sexual activity knowing that there is a risk of pregnancy is in a very different context. There's a responsibility and agency there that don't exist in the weird science fiction analogy of seeds blowing through the window. But this is where Judith makes a major concession. She says, in some cases, abortion might not be permissible. And while that seems like a logical enough thing to say, it's something that many pro-choice advocates do not want to grant. They want to leave the decision entirely in the minds and hands and will of the mother. But Thomson seems to grant that there is some level of responsibility here, which would make abortion impermissible. In Section 5, she tries to pedal that back a little bit and say just because someone ought to do something doesn't mean that another person is entitled to receive that which ought to be done. The person who might receive a good thing doesn't have a right to it, though the giver ought to give it to them. If a boy has been given chocolates, not for both of them, but just for him, he ought to share them with his brother, but the brother doesn't have a right to them because they're not his. Henry Fonda ought to go and cool Judith's brow, but he doesn't have to. It's not her right to insist upon it, and he is not obligated to do it, though he ought to. So even if we leave open the possibility that an unborn child might have a right to live in certain circumstances, it doesn't mean universally that because someone ought to do something that the recipients universally have a right to it. She clarifies a little bit further in Section 6, but Section 6 is now dated. In Section 6, she quotes the story of the Good Samaritan from the teachings of Jesus, from the Bible. And she says, we might expect a minimal level of decency from people, but we don't generally legally require it. For instance, you're not generally legally required to report a crime even though you know a crime happened. It would be a minimally decent thing to do, but it's not a legally obligatory thing to do. Now in this one, she's just wrong. And I don't know the laws in 1971 or what she was referring to, but if you witness a felony and don't report it, you can be held legally liable for it. You are not off the hook when you witness a crime. So here her analogy doesn't hold anymore. She said it would be minimally decent for a woman who allowed the pregnancy to happen to then not take the life of the child. But, Thomson says, it would be hypocritical to require minimal decency in this case when we don't require it in other cases. Well, in fact, we do legally require minimal decency in other cases, and so in this case, the argument again backfires. It would be an awfully good Samaritan who allows the violinist to live for 9 months dependent on their body, but we don't have good Samaritan laws where somebody is obligated to take on significant burdens for the sake of others. And contrary-wise, you might argue that it's an act of good Samaritanism for a doctor to grant an abortion to a woman who really, really wants it. Section 7 deals with sort of a tangential question that, again, I don't hear people leveling in the debates over abortion, but she says you can't argue that there's some special obligation on the mother by virtue of the fact that she is the mother to allow the child to live. She actually says it's not until the mother brings the child home as a life that she bestows rights upon it. I think this fails to appreciate the laws against infanticide, which have very little to do with the will of the mother. And in Section 8, she does kind of pursue that caveat. She says, this essay isn't going to make everyone happy because I don't simply give a blanket yes or no on whether or not abortion is permissible. And in fact, she takes a strong stand against the right of a mother to terminate the life of a child who survives an abortion. So if in the midst of an abortion, a child proves to be able to live independently of the mother, she says at that point, the deal's off and the child has a right to life. She then concludes her essay with a completely unsubstantiated argument that an early term abortion is in no way murder. She doesn't defend it or explain it, she just asserts it again, which is one final way of reminding her audience, I'm not a very good philosopher. So there are three major problems with her essay. Number one, some of her presuppositions, some of her stances are question begging. When she says, certainly if anything else in the world is true, she's asserting that she has philosophical presuppositions from which she is beginning. Now, every philosopher has to begin with presuppositions. I presume that there are other minds out there, that the external world exists, that communication works. At some level, I have to begin somewhere. So she can't be faulted for that. The problem is the places she assumes get awfully close to begging the question of the things she's setting out to defend. Secondly, metaphors are slippery. Analogies are hard to track. They appeal to gut intuitions and feelings rather than stating in propositional terms rational claims that can be analyzed. They run the risk of the reader mistaking what analogy is being made or which analogs are actually appropriate in the connection. And every analogy can be carried further than it's intended to apply, rendering the comparison false or skewed. And finally, thirdly, she pays absolutely minimal attention to the responsibility that a woman or a couple bear when they willfully engage in sexual activity and become pregnant. She seems to dismiss this entirely, though that is the vast majority of abortions. The cases of abortion in which we're talking about a threat to the woman's life or a case of rape are absolutely fractional compared to the majority of abortions, which have to do with a couple who, for whatever reason, find that a pregnancy is inconvenient. A better analogy for JJ Thompson to consider might be this one. Imagine, in a dystopian universe, a horrendous man has been elected president and taken power over the world. Everywhere he goes, he plants these seedy casinos known as dump casinos. A woman goes into this posh Las Vegas casino for a night of gambling and amusement, and there's one particularly high-paying roulette wheel. Many of the payouts include lascivious pleasures. However, there's also a lesser chance that the ball might land on a certain number, and when it does, she will be in the situation of having to choose whether or not to kill an innocent life or take on a horrendous personal imposition of caring for that life. It might sound ridiculous, but remember, in history, emperors have taken over and forced people to fight to the death in gladiatorial competitions, and if you think it couldn't happen again, you're just being naive. Knowing that that is even a slim chance, is she not then obligated not to ever put herself in that situation? And if she willfully puts herself in that situation anyway, is she not then obligated not to kill? Because that is far and away the most common context for abortion. So you might be able to use JJ Thompson's arguments to defend abortion, but only in the case of rape or threats to a woman's life. The general application of her analogy doesn't hold well. And so it ought to give you pause to wonder why professors are still so eagerly assigning this essay. If you're a college sophomore taking Introduction to Philosophy and you didn't exactly have time to do the reading, go ahead and post in the comments the essays or authors that you're reading, and maybe I'll post a video on them, and then you won't have to do your homework because you should be out living your best life now.